June 15, 1944. The metal chains rattled against Heinrich Müller's wrists as the transport ship lurched through another Atlantic swell. Below deck, in the suffocating hold of the USS General William Mitchell, 300 German prisoners of war sat in stunned silence, their hollow eyes reflecting the uncertainty of their fate. The 22-year-old Wehrmacht soldier had been captured during the chaotic retreat from Normandy, his unit overwhelmed by the relentless Allied advance just 9 days after D-Day. "They will work us to death in their coal mines," whispered Feldwebel Klaus Weber, his scarred face bearing testament to years of brutal warfare. "The Americans are no different from the Bolsheviks." The seasoned, non-commissioned officer had survived Stalingrad and the hellish retreat across the Eastern Front, where captured German soldiers simply vanished into the Soviet gulags, never to return. Heinrich's stomach cramped with hunger as he remembered the meager rations that had sustained him during the final months of fighting in France. Black bread mixed with sawdust, ersatz coffee made from acorns, and the occasional thin soup had become luxuries as Germany's war machine crumbled under the weight of Allied bombing and blockades. The fatherland was starving, and its soldiers were dying not just from bullets, but from malnutrition and despair. The ship's engines thrummed monotonously as Oberleutnant Friedrich von Stauffen, a Prussian officer from an old military family, maintained his rigid posture despite the deplorable conditions. His uniform, once pristine and decorated with campaign ribbons from Poland and France, now hung loosely on his gaunt frame. "Whatever awaits us," he declared quietly to his fellow prisoners, "we shall maintain our dignity and honor as German soldiers." As the vessel cut through the dark waters toward America, stories circulated among the prisoners about Soviet prison camps where German captives were forced to subsist on watery cabbage soup and died by the thousands from starvation and exposure. The propaganda they had been fed painted all of Germany's enemies with the same brush of brutality and revenge. Sergeant First Class Robert Johnson of the United States Army stood guard at the entrance to the hold, his Springfield rifle at the ready. The African-American soldier from Alabama had witnessed firsthand the horrors of Nazi concentration camps during the liberation of France, yet he maintained professional composure as he observed the dejected enemy soldiers. His orders were clear: treat prisoners according to the Geneva Convention, regardless of personal feelings about their cause. The crossing would take 8 more days. 8 days of uncertainty and fear for men who had been indoctrinated to believe that capture by Western allies meant certain death or slavery. They could not have imagined that their destination, Camp Alva in Oklahoma, would challenge everything they had been told about American brutality and reshape their understanding of their former enemies. As night fell over the Atlantic, Heinrich clutched a crumpled photograph of his mother and sister in Dresden, wondering if he would ever see them again, unaware that his greatest shock would not come from American cruelty, but from unexpected kindness. June 23, 1944. The train's whistle pierced the humid Oklahoma air as it pulled into the small station near Camp Alva, carrying its cargo of bewildered German prisoners. Heinrich Müller pressed his face against the barred window, squinting in the harsh American sunlight that seemed so different from the gray skies of war-torn Europe. The landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, a vast expanse of prairie that made the confined spaces of the fatherland seem impossibly small. Camp Alva sprawled across 1,500 acres of Oklahoma farmland, its wooden barracks and guard towers rising from the earth like a temporary city. Colonel James Harrison, the camp commander, stood waiting on the platform with several of his staff officers. The 50-year-old career soldier had served in the Great War and understood the delicate balance between security and humanity that governed prisoner of war operations under international law. "Welcome to America, gentlemen," Colonel Harrison announced through an interpreter as the prisoners disembarked. His words carried no malice, only the professional courtesy of a soldier addressing fellow soldiers, albeit former enemies. This initial reception confused many of the Germans, who had expected harsh treatment and immediate forced labor. Klaus Weber shuffled forward in the formation, his experienced eyes scanning the camp's perimeter for signs of the brutal conditions he anticipated. Instead, he observed American guards who appeared well-fed and disciplined, their uniforms clean and their equipment modern. The guard towers were manned but not bristling with machine guns pointed inward, and the barbed wire, while present, seemed more administrative than menacing. As documented in the War Department's official records from this period, American POW camps were required to provide conditions equivalent to those of U.S. military personnel in similar circumstances. This policy, rooted in both humanitarian principles and practical considerations about reciprocal treatment of American prisoners, would prove shocking to men who had witnessed the systematic starvation and abuse characteristic of Nazi prisoner facilities. Friedrich von Stauffen maintained his officer's bearing as he was separated from the enlisted men, a practice that followed military protocol rather than punitive segregation. The Prussian aristocrat had served in Wehrmacht units that had shown little mercy to captured Soviet soldiers, justifying such treatment through Nazi racial ideology and the fiction of Bolshevik subhumanity. Now he found himself subject to the very international laws his own military had systematically violated. The processing began immediately, with American personnel documenting each prisoner according to Geneva Convention requirements. Heinrich received a prisoner identification number, a basic medical examination, and delousing treatment that, while humiliating, was conducted with clinical efficiency rather than deliberate degradation. The young soldier had expected interrogation under bright lights and physical coercion, not forms filled out in triplicate and questions about his dietary restrictions. Captain Mary Sullivan, an Army nurse from Boston, supervised the medical screening with professional detachment. She had volunteered for overseas service after her brother died at Anzio, yet her treatment of the German prisoners remained scrupulously correct. "These men are malnourished," she reported to Colonel Harrison. "Several cases of vitamin deficiency, possible scurvy, and general malnutrition consistent with prolonged poor diet." The revelation that many prisoners were suffering from malnutrition was not surprising to camp administrators who had processed earlier groups of German captives. The collapse of Germany's food distribution system, combined with the Wehrmacht's practice of giving priority rations to combat units while support personnel subsisted on increasingly meager fare, had produced an army of hungry soldiers long before their capture. As evening approached on that first day, the prisoners were assigned to barracks and introduced to the camp's daily routine. What awaited them in the mess hall would challenge every assumption they held about American intentions and capabilities. June 24th, 1944. The mess hall at Camp Alva fell silent as 300 German prisoners filed through the serving line, their eyes wide with disbelief at what lay before them. Heinrich Müller stared at the metal tray placed in his hands, unable to process what he was seeing. Real beef, thick slices of it, lay next to mashed potatoes swimming in butter, green beans that appeared fresh rather than preserved, and a roll of white bread that seemed impossibly soft and clean. "Es ist ein Trick," whispered Klaus Weber, voicing what many prisoners were thinking. "It is a trick." The veteran sergeant had survived the siege of Leningrad, where German forces had deliberately starved the civilian population, and he could not comprehend why their captors would provide such abundance to enemy prisoners. In his experience, food was a weapon, and generous rations were either bait for collaboration or evidence of American waste and decadence. Private Tommy Kowalski from Chicago worked the serving line, ladling portions with mechanical efficiency, while observing the prisoners' reactions. The 19-year-old had grown up during the Depression, when his Polish immigrant family had sometimes gone without meals. Yet even he found the prisoners' amazement puzzling. "More potatoes?" he asked Heinrich through gestures, and the German soldier nodded mutely, still unable to believe that his captors were offering seconds. According to military records preserved in the National Archives, American POW camps were required to provide approximately 3,700 calories per day to each prisoner, a ration that often exceeded what many American civilians received during wartime food restrictions. This policy stemmed from both humanitarian obligations under international law and practical recognition that well-fed prisoners were healthier, more cooperative, and less likely to attempt escape. Friedrich von Stauffen sat rigidly at one of the long wooden tables, his Prussian training warring with his body's desperate need for nutrition. The officer had lost nearly 30 pounds during the final months of fighting in France, as Wehrmacht rations dwindled to starvation levels and supply lines collapsed under Allied bombing. Now he faced a moral dilemma. Was eating this American food a betrayal of his starving comrades still fighting in Europe, or simply the pragmatic choice of a soldier adapting to circumstances? The prisoners ate in suspicious silence, many expecting the food to be drugged or poisoned, others simply unable to process the psychological impact of such abundance after months of deprivation. Heinrich's stomach, unaccustomed to rich food, cramped painfully as he consumed his first real meal in memory, yet he could not stop eating. The flavors seemed impossibly intense after months of ersatz substitutes and watery soup. Chaplain William Rodriguez, a Catholic priest from New Mexico, observed the scene from the edge of the mess hall. He had volunteered for military service after Pearl Harbor, driven by a desire to serve his country and minister to soldiers far from home. What struck him most about the German prisoners was not their obvious hunger, but their evident confusion at being treated with basic human dignity. As the meal progressed, small conversations began to emerge among the prisoners, whispered exchanges in German that revealed their bewilderment. Some wondered if this was standard American military fare. Others speculated that they were being fattened for heavy labor or medical experiments. None yet grasped that they were simply receiving the treatment mandated by international law and American military doctrine. The evening's revelations would continue beyond the mess hall, as prisoners discovered that their barracks contained actual mattresses, clean blankets, and functioning latrines. For soldiers who had spent months sleeping in muddy foxholes and abandoned buildings, such basic amenities seemed like luxury accommodations reserved for high-ranking officers. Heinrich finished his meal and looked around the mess hall, seeing his fellow prisoners slowly emerging from their initial shock. Tomorrow would bring new surprises, but tonight, for the first time in months, German soldiers would sleep with full stomachs and begin to question everything they had been told about their American enemies. July 2nd, 1944. The post-exchange at Camp Alva buzzed with activity as German prisoners lined up with their weekly canteen allowance, clutching scrip money earned through camp work programs. Heinrich Müller stood in disbelief before shelves stocked with items that had become legendary luxuries in wartime Germany. Hershey's chocolate bars, Coca-Cola, cigarettes, and candy that he had not seen since before the war began in 1939. Schokolade, breathed Unteroffizier Hans Dietrich, a tank crewman from the Afrika Korps who had been captured in Tunisia the previous year. The 24-year-old mechanical engineer from Stuttgart reached for a chocolate bar with trembling hands, remembering how such treats had disappeared from German stores by 1941, replaced by saccharine substitutes made from beet sugar and artificial flavorings that barely resembled the real thing. Staff Sergeant Mike O'Brien, the Irish-American NCO who managed the canteen, watched the German prisoners' reactions with growing understanding. The stocky soldier from Boston had initially viewed his assignment to guard duty as punishment for a bar fight in England, but months of observing prisoner behavior had given him insights into the true state of the German war effort that intelligence officers found valuable. The chocolate revelation went beyond mere luxury. It represented a fundamental challenge to Nazi propaganda about American industrial weakness and decadence. German soldiers had been told that the United States lacked the industrial capacity for sustained warfare, that American workers were soft and undisciplined, and that the capitalist system would collapse under the pressure of total war. Yet here was evidence of an economy so robust that it could provide luxury goods to enemy prisoners while simultaneously fighting a global conflict. As documented in reports from the International Red Cross, which maintained inspection rights at American POW facilities, the canteen privileges extended to German prisoners often exceeded what German civilians could obtain with their ration cards. This disparity created profound cognitive dissonance among prisoners who had believed in the superiority of the German economic system and the efficiency of Nazi resource allocation. Klaus Weber purchased his first Coca-Cola, the dark liquid fizzing strangely in the bottle as he examined it suspiciously. The veteran sergeant had heard rumors about this American beverage, described in German propaganda as a symbol of capitalist corruption and cultural degeneracy. As he took his first sip, the sweet carbonation hit his taste buds with an intensity that seemed almost medicinal after years of ersatz drinks made from whatever could be found or manufactured. Friedrich von Stauffen faced a different dilemma as he surveyed the canteen offerings. His Prussian code of honor demanded that he maintain distance from his captors and avoid any appearance of collaboration. Yet his practical mind recognized the intelligence value of understanding American industrial capacity. The availability of consumer goods to prisoners suggested a level of economic abundance that contradicted everything German planners had assumed about American war production. The psychological impact of the canteen extended beyond individual prisoners to the broader dynamics of camp life. Men who had fought desperately for survival began to contemplate futures beyond mere existence, discussing plans and dreams that had seemed impossible during the grinding warfare of the previous years. Heinrich found himself writing letters home describing American abundance, though he suspected such correspondence would never reach his family in Dresden. Captain Robert Chen, the Chinese-American intelligence officer responsible for monitoring prisoner morale and gathering information about German military capabilities, noted the transformative effect of consumer goods on prisoner attitudes. Men who had initially maintained rigid military discipline and ideological commitment gradually became more talkative and cooperative as they experienced American material culture firsthand. The evening brought another surprise as prisoners discovered that the camp theater would be showing American films, complete with German subtitles provided by educated prisoners who served as translators. The prospect of entertainment, rather than political indoctrination, represented yet another departure from their expectations of prison camp life. As Heinrich savored his chocolate bar, letting each piece melt slowly on his tongue, he began to understand that he was witnessing something more profound than American generosity. This was evidence of a society that could afford to be generous, an economy so powerful that it could provide luxuries to its enemies while fighting the most extensive war in human history. July 15, 1944. The camp post office at Camp Alva processed hundreds of letters each week, carefully censored documents that carried news of American abundance back to a starving and desperate Germany. Heinrich Müller bent over his writing desk, struggling to find words that would convey his experience without sounding like enemy propaganda to his mother and sister in Dresden, a city increasingly targeted by Allied bombing raids that turned neighborhoods into rubble. Liebe Mutter, he began, his pen hovering uncertainly over the paper. How could he explain that he was eating better as a prisoner than he had as a free soldier? How could he describe chocolate and fresh fruit to people who had forgotten such luxuries existed? The censors would allow his letter through, but would his family believe what he wrote, or would they assume he had been coerced into spreading enemy lies? Male censorship officer Lieutenant Sarah Goldman, a German Jewish refugee who had fled Berlin in 1938, read through prisoner correspondence with complex emotions. The young woman had lost relatives in the Holocaust, yet her professional duty required her to facilitate communication between enemy prisoners and their families. What struck her most about the letters was their genuine amazement at American conditions, rather than any calculated propaganda effort. Klaus Weber's letter to his wife in Munich reflected the bewilderment of a career soldier confronting an enemy that defied all his expectations. The Americans feed us meat every day, real meat, not the horse flesh or worse that we had in the final months. They have so much food that they throw away what German civilians would fight over. Their guards are well fed, and their equipment is new. This is not the weak, decadent enemy we were told we were fighting. According to intelligence reports compiled by the Office of Strategic Services, letters from German POWs in American camps began arriving in Germany by late summer of 1944, creating significant morale problems among both civilian and military populations. Descriptions of American abundance contrasted sharply with the increasingly desperate shortages affecting daily life throughout the Reich, undermining Nazi propaganda about the inevitable victory of the superior German system. Friedrich von Stauffen wrestled with his own correspondence, his aristocratic code conflicting with the evidence of his senses. Writing to his elderly father, a retired Prussian general living on the family estate in East Prussia, the captured officer tried to maintain military dignity while acknowledging realities that contradicted decades of professional assumptions. The American war machine operates with an efficiency and abundance that challenges our strategic calculations. Their ability to provide for prisoners while maintaining global military operations suggests industrial capacity beyond our intelligence estimates. The ripple effects of these letters extended far beyond individual families. German postal authorities, recognizing the potential impact of such correspondence on civilian morale, began censoring prisoner mail more heavily, sometimes preventing delivery entirely. However, enough letters reached their destinations to create whispered conversations in Berlin breadlines and Munich bomb shelters about the true state of American resources. Private Danny Sullivan, working in the camp post office, observed the emotional intensity with which prisoners crafted their letters home. The young man from South Boston had grown up during the Depression when his Irish immigrant family had survived on charity and determination. He understood hunger and deprivation, but the German prisoners' descriptions of wartime conditions in their homeland shocked him with their severity. Heinrich's letter continued with careful descriptions that skirted censorship guidelines. "We receive fresh vegetables that I have not tasted since the war began. The American soldiers guarding us appear healthy and strong, their uniforms are clean, and they seem to have no shortage of equipment or supplies. The camp has electric lights, hot water, and medical facilities that would be considered luxury in many German towns." The psychological warfare implications of prisoner correspondence were not lost on American intelligence agencies. Well-fed, well-treated German POWs who wrote positively about their experience served as inadvertent ambassadors, undermining Nazi propaganda and contributing to German civilian war weariness. This soft power approach proved more effective than harsh treatment in breaking enemy morale and gathering intelligence. As summer progressed, the volume of prisoner mail increased dramatically, carrying with it a message that Nazi censors struggled to suppress. America possessed not only the will to fight, but the economic strength to sustain a global war while treating even its enemies with unprecedented generosity. For a regime built on the premise of American weakness and decadence, such evidence posed an existential threat to ideological foundations. August 10th. 1944. The cotton fields surrounding Camp Alva stretched to the horizon as German prisoners worked alongside American civilian laborers, their presence filling critical gaps in the agricultural workforce depleted by military conscription. Heinrich Müller wiped sweat from his brow as he guided the mechanical cotton picker, marveling at American agricultural technology that made German farming methods seem primitive by comparison. Under the Geneva Convention's provisions for prisoner labor, German POWs could be employed in non-military work that contributed to their maintenance and the general economy. What surprised the prisoners was not the requirement to work, but the wages they received for their labor, 80 cents per day, paid in camp scrip that could be used for canteen purchases, personal items, and even savings accounts that would be converted to currency upon repatriation. Obergefreiter Wilhelm Schneider, a farmer's son from Bavaria who had been conscripted into the Wehrmacht in 1943, found himself teaching American agricultural workers about crop rotation techniques developed on German farms over centuries. The cultural exchange that emerged from shared labor created relationships that transcended the prisoner-guard dynamic and challenged preconceptions on both sides. "These Americans work hard," Wilhelm admitted to Heinrich during their lunch break, sharing sandwiches made with white bread, processed meat, and fresh vegetables. "Their machines are better than anything we had on the farm, but they listen when I show them techniques for soil management. They treat me like a person, not an enemy." The realization that Americans valued his expertise rather than simply exploiting his labor represented a profound shift in his understanding of capitalist society. Camp Administrator Colonel Harrison had implemented work programs that went beyond agricultural labor to include carpentry, mechanics, and even clerical work for educated prisoners. The policy reflected both practical needs and psychological insights about maintaining prisoner morale and facilitating post-war reintegration. Idle prisoners became depressed and potentially troublesome. Productive prisoners maintained dignity and purpose. As documented in Army reports from this period, German POW labor contributed significantly to American agricultural production during critical labor shortages. However, the psychological impact of this arrangement proved equally important, as prisoners experienced firsthand the efficiency of American industrial agriculture and the relative prosperity of even rural American communities. Klaus Weber found himself assigned to the camp's motor pool, maintaining trucks and equipment with mechanical skills learned during his Wehrmacht service. Working alongside Sergeant Joe Martinez from Texas, the German veteran began to understand American military logistics and the scale of industrial production that supported the war effort. "Your factories must work day and night to produce so many vehicles," he observed, and Martinez replied simply, "That's what we do. We make things." The economic lessons extended beyond immediate work experience to broader observations about American society. Prisoners noticed that their American guards and civilian co-workers possessed personal automobiles, something that had been luxury items available only to wealthy Germans before the war. The implications were staggering. American workers earned wages sufficient to purchase manufactured goods that German workers could never afford. Friedrich von Stauffen, assigned to clerical duties that utilized his education and language skills, found himself processing supply requisitions that revealed the scope of American military procurement. The sheer volume of material flowing through Camp Alva, food, clothing, equipment, fuel, suggested an economy operating at a scale that German planners had never imagined possible. The work programs also provided opportunities for cultural exchange that humanized both sides of the conflict. American workers shared stories of their families, their hometowns, and their hopes for post-war life, while German prisoners gradually opened up about their own experiences and perspectives. These conversations often revealed that ordinary soldiers on both sides had more in common with each other than with the political leaders who had started the war. Evening discussions in the barracks increasingly focused on economic and social comparisons between American and German systems. Prisoners who had accepted Nazi propaganda about capitalist exploitation and worker oppression found themselves confronting evidence that American workers enjoyed higher living standards and greater personal freedom than their German counterparts under the supposedly superior National Socialist system. The work experience transformed prisoners' understanding not only of American economic capacity, but also of their own potential futures. Men who had seen only destruction and deprivation began to envision post-war possibilities, planning for reconstruction and renewal based on lessons learned during their captivity. September 5, 1944. The camp theater at Camp Alva hummed with animated conversation as German prisoners discussed the American film they had just watched, a musical comedy featuring elaborate dance numbers and lavish production values that seemed to mock the austerity and propaganda films of the Third Reich. Heinrich Müller sat in stunned silence, trying to process not just the entertainment value of what he had seen, but its implications about American society and resources. Hollywood Canteen had been selected by camp officials specifically for its portrayal of American civilian life during wartime, showing well-dressed people enjoying abundance and luxury while supporting the war effort through entertainment rather than sacrifice. For prisoners accustomed to German propaganda films that emphasized duty, suffering, and racial superiority, this glimpse into American popular culture proved profoundly disorienting. Captain Thomas Anderson, the camp's education officer and a former high school principal from Iowa, supervised recreational and educational programs designed to expose German prisoners to democratic values and American culture. The 35-year-old educator understood that changing minds required more than propaganda. It demanded positive experiences that contradicted Nazi ideology through lived example rather than rhetoric. The camp's library, stocked with German language books and American publications translated into German, became a focal point for intellectual transformation. Klaus Weber, who had received limited education before his military service, found himself reading American history and political theory for the first time. "They write about freedom as if it were possible," he confided to Heinrich. "Not just freedom to obey the state, but freedom to think differently." Educational programs extended beyond passive consumption to active participation in classes covering American government, history, and economics. Friedrich von Stauffen, despite his initial resistance, found himself attending lectures about democratic institutions and constitutional law, comparing American political structures to the authoritarian systems he had served. The Prussian officer's worldview, built on concepts of hierarchy and obedience, encountered ideas about individual rights and popular sovereignty that challenged fundamental assumptions. According to military intelligence assessments, recreational and educational programs at POW camps served dual purposes: maintaining prisoner morale while gradually undermining Nazi ideological commitment. The approach proved more effective than direct propaganda, as prisoners drew their own conclusions from positive experiences rather than resisting imposed messages. The camp's sports programs created additional opportunities for cultural exchange and personal growth. German prisoners organized soccer teams that competed against American service units, creating bonds of friendly rivalry that transcended national boundaries. Heinrich discovered that he enjoyed playing baseball, a uniquely American sport that required teamwork and strategy in ways different from the more individualistic European games he knew. Music became another bridge between cultures as prisoners formed bands and orchestras that performed both German and American pieces. Unteroffizier Hans Dietrich, the former tank crewman, revealed unexpected talent as a pianist, playing everything from Bach to American jazz standards learned from records in the camp's music library. These performances, attended by both prisoners and American personnel, created moments of shared humanity that transcended the prisoner-guard relationship. The transformation was not universal or immediate. Some prisoners, particularly hardcore Nazi Party members, maintained ideological resistance and attempted to organize opposition to educational programs. However, these efforts gradually weakened as the daily reality of American treatment contradicted propaganda about Western brutality and decadence. Religious services, conducted by both American military chaplains and German clergymen among the prisoners, provided additional opportunities for reflection and change. Father Müller, a Catholic priest captured while serving as a Wehrmacht chaplain, found himself collaborating with American clergy to provide spiritual guidance that emphasized universal human values rather than national or racial divisions. The psychological warfare implications of recreational and educational programs extended beyond individual transformation to broader strategic objectives. Well-educated, democratically oriented former German prisoners would eventually return to their homeland, carrying with them positive experiences and alternative perspectives that could contribute to post-war reconstruction and denazification efforts. As autumn arrived in Oklahoma, Heinrich realized that his understanding of America, democracy, and human nature had fundamentally changed during his months in captivity. The enemy he had been taught to hate had become a complex society that combined strength with generosity, efficiency with humanity, and power with restraint. December 7th, 1944. On the third anniversary of Pearl Harbor, Heinrich Müller stood at the camp's perimeter fence, watching American bombers fly overhead in formation. Their destination, the aircraft factories of the American Midwest, that would soon deliver more weapons to the European theater. The sight that once would have filled him with dread now carried different meaning. Evidence of industrial might that served justice rather than conquest, democracy rather than tyranny. The news from Germany had grown increasingly grim throughout the autumn of 1944. Letters from home, when they arrived at all, described cities in ruins, civilians fleeing advancing Allied armies, and a Nazi regime growing more desperate and brutal as defeat approached. Heinrich's sister had written from Dresden about food riots and SS executions of defeatists, creating a stark contrast with his own experience of American abundance and due process. Christmas preparations at Camp Alva revealed the depth of cultural transformation that had occurred among the German prisoners. Klaus Weber, now serving as a prisoner representative on the camp council, worked with American officials to organize holiday celebrations that honored both German traditions and American generosity. The veteran sergeant who had once expected death or slavery now spoke respectfully of his captors and their democratic institutions. "We were lied to about everything," Weber admitted to a group of newly arrived prisoners from the Battle of the Bulge, men still carrying the shock of Germany's final offensive and its failure. "The Americans are not weak or decadent. They are strong because they choose to be strong, not because they are forced to be strong. There is a difference that we were never taught to understand." The Christmas feast at Camp Alva surpassed even the regular abundance that had amazed prisoners throughout their captivity. Real turkey, fresh vegetables, fruit, dairy products, and desserts created a banquet that would have been impossible for most German civilians even before the war began. American guards shared the meal with prisoners, a gesture of humanity that completed the transformation of enemies into fellow human beings. Friedrich von Stauffen had undergone perhaps the most profound change of any prisoner at Camp Alva. The Prussian aristocrat who had arrived with rigid military bearing and unshakable faith in German superiority now spent his evenings reading American constitutional law and writing detailed analyses of democratic institutions. His correspondence with his father had evolved from military reports to philosophical discussions about governance, freedom, and human dignity. As documented in post-war intelligence assessments, the psychological transformation of German prisoners in American camps created a cadre of potential democratic leaders for post-war reconstruction. Men who had experienced democracy firsthand, even as prisoners, understood its practical benefits in ways that theoretical instruction could never achieve. The final months of captivity brought preparation for repatriation and return to a Germany that would need rebuilding not just physically, but morally and politically. Heinrich and his fellow prisoners had learned skills, attitudes, and perspectives that would prove valuable in the massive task of democratic reconstruction that awaited their homeland. On a cold December morning, Heinrich received news that would define the rest of his life. His hometown of Dresden had been bombed by Allied aircraft, and his family's fate remained unknown. Yet rather than hatred or desire for revenge, he felt sadness for all the families, German and Allied, who had suffered from the war that Nazi aggression had initiated. The transformation was complete. Enemy soldiers had become students of democracy. Prisoners of war had become ambassadors of understanding, and men who had served tyranny had learned to value freedom. Their experience at Camp Alva represented more than humane treatment of prisoners. It demonstrated the power of democratic values to change hearts and minds through example rather than force. As Heinrich prepared for eventual repatriation, he carried with him not just memories of abundant food and humane treatment, but understanding of a society that could afford to be generous because it was built on principles of human dignity, individual freedom, and cooperative effort. These lessons would shape not only his own post-war life, but contribute to the broader transformation of Germany from dictatorship to democracy. The German prisoners who had arrived at Camp Alva expecting death and finding chocolate had discovered something more valuable than food: hope for a different kind of future built on different kinds of values. Their story testified to the power of democracy not just to defeat enemies in war, but to transform them into partners in peace.